On to today's session about mise en texte, and it's my great pleasure first to introduce Neil Keeble. Neil is Professor Emeritus of English Studies at Stirling University, Scotland. His academic and research interests lie in English cultural and especially literary and religious history of the period 1500 to 1725. He has published widely in this field, in particular on the Puritan tradition and the Restoration period. He has edited 5 collections of original essays and texts by John Bunyan, Daniel Defoe, Lucy Hutchinson, Andrew Marvell, and John Milton. With John Coffey, Tim Cooper, and Thomas Charlton, he edited Richard Baxter's autobiographical Reliquiae Baxterianae in 5 volumes 2 years ago, Oxford University Press, and there you go, just to preview. This is volume 1, and then we got
Thank you very much
as well. So I just thought I will show you that. So Neil, when you're ready, it's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and it's a very great pleasure for me and for Tessa. We're delighted to have the chance to participate in this seminar series. We're going to be sharing some thoughts about what we're actually looking at when we read early modern books. I think we tend to think of a book as a pretty straightforward representation of its author's intentions, not only in the words of its text, but in its design, layout, and presentation, the arrangement of the material. Well, however true that may be now, it was not the case in the early modern period, when the processes of production and dissemination had quite as much to do, and often more, with what a reader saw as any role played by the author. There was also a period when no one copy of any particular book could be expected to be exactly like any other copy of the same book. Words with the same title might differ not only in their texts, but more largely in their contents and layout. So the theme of this session is the instability, variability, and unreliability of early modern printed texts, and the need for caution in inferring from any presentational feature authorial intention or warrant. I'll talk about the production of 17th century texts, chiefly the works of the eminent Puritan divine and nonconformist leader Richard Baxter, 1615 to 91. And then Tessa will speak about the posthumous publication and reception of texts in the 18th century, focusing on the activities of the leading dissenter Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1748. And will incidentally also reflect on the challenge of representing these texts in modern editions. So I begin where any book begins, with the author. But straight away we run into difficulties because we generally do not know what exactly an author wrote or what he, or less often she, sent to the press. We have very few early modern autograph manuscripts, the author's own copy of their texts, because it was the practice of printing houses to destroy the author's manuscript when type had been set. They threw it in the bin because it was of no further use. So usually we can't know how accurately a printed text represents the author's handwritten copy, nor whether any features of its presentation derive from his wishes. But we do know from the few cases that survive that it was the press and not the author who made most of the decisions about presentation, layout, title pages, and details such as spelling and capitalization. One source of evidence for this is Richard Baxter's monumental autobiographical and historical memoir, published as a 900-page folio in 1696 under the title Reliquiae Baxterianae, and as Anne mentioned, recently edited in 5 volumes for OUP. Almost uniquely, a large part of Baxter's original manuscript does survive. The reason is that at his death in 1691, the work on which Baxter had been engaged since 1664, over 25 years, was unfinished. And Baxter's literary executor, his colleague Matthew Sylvester, was left with what Sylvester described as a great quantity of loose papers in various states of completeness and with instructions and directions and notes often conflicting about how they should be arranged. So these papers had to be put in order before they were fit to go to the press. Sylvester took the drastic decision to write out a fair copy of the whole thing. And I say drastic since it's over 1 million words long. And so it was Sylvester's fair copy that 5 years later went to the press and was eventually destroyed, while Baxter's own original papers survived and are in large part still extant. So in this case, we can see what happened to an author's manuscript when it went through editing and printing. There are many hundreds of textual differences between the manuscript and the printed text. Some of these, of course, will be Sylvester's, but many of them the printing houses. And there are also more substantial revisions, deletions, and rearrangements, of which more in a moment. In this process of preparing a manuscript for print, the role of the compositor, the person who set the type for printing, was crucial, most obviously in the matter of spelling. There was no standardized spelling in the 17th century. It began to develop in the 18th. The oft-cited example is Shakespeare, whose 6 surviving signatures spell his name variously, ending P-E-R-E, P-E-A-R-E, and P-E-R. So apparently Shakespeare didn't know how to spell his own name. Hence, compositors had no learned or standardized spelling system to apply automatically, and no reason to follow the author's own particular spelling. They instead followed their own individual habits and practice. It would be much quicker than having to think about whether to spell a word this way or that. So modern editors who agonize over the spelling of 17th century printed texts are usually only reproducing the style of the compositor, not the author. And the compositor often adjusted spelling simply to make words fit on a line. So they would add a final E or double a consonant if the line was too short, or abbreviate a word if it was too long. These habits could be quite distinctive. It's possible sometimes to tell which parts of a book a particular compositor set and which were set by another in the print house. What happened was, when the author's manuscript arrived, it was divided up amongst available compositors and they each set the type for a section of the book. And the abrupt transitions in accidentals make it clear that it was they and not the author who were responsible for the details of presentation. And of course, they made mistakes. With his right hand, the compositor selected individual letters from a case of type to put in a composing stick held in his left hand. And of course, sometimes they picked up the wrong letter or set it upside down by mistake. Now, as printing got underway, sheets might be checked as they came off the press and such mistakes spotted, in which case the press was stopped and the typesetting corrected. But the sheets already printed weren't thrown away. That would have been wasteful. They were gathered up willy-nilly with corrected sheets to make up the books in an edition. So individual copies of a single edition will differ, since what's in any particular copy is made up of corrected and uncorrected sheets in no particular order. The text depended simply on which sheets were picked up for a gathering, and perhaps binding, though usually books were sold unbound. So no two copies of a title are quite the same. And notice, the authors had nothing to do with any of this. They very rarely attended the press after giving over the manuscript, leading sometimes to authorial dismay when they finally saw printed copy. In some printed texts, there are brief notes added in which the author apologizes for the number of errors and explains, I couldn't attend the press for proof correction and the printers made a right mess of it. Similarly, features such as title pages, choice of format, type size, capitalization, italicization, all these are from the printing house. So we can't really know what to make of a word in italics or uppercase letters, since we don't know if this was in the author's manuscript. Baxter's handwritten copy makes much less use of capitalization than the 1696 printed version. Often words in italics aren't so distinguished by him. And these details are likely to diverge, particularly when time has elapsed. Baxter, as I said, began work on the Reliquii in 1664. By 1691, when it passed to Sylvester, conventions about style, taste, and presentation had changed considerably. There was the beginning of a standardized, grammatically orderly English style of regular punctuation and such like, and Baxter was made to fit in with this new taste. So I'm suggesting that a printed edition is the product of the press, not the author, and is not an especially reliable representation of the author's own copy, and no two copies of a book in a single edition will be quite the same. But beyond those textual differences, the structure and contents of a book more at large could be variable. Book production was a high-speed activity, and particularly when religious and political controversies were involved, the development of the text could be an ongoing process, even when the press had begun printing, leading to an expansion of the contents after some copies had been printed and even distributed. Baxter, for example, in 1654, published his Apology, explaining his thinking on the doctrine of justification in response to various opponents and detractors. But their animadversions kept appearing in print as he was working on his reply. So what began as a reply to a critic called Thomas Blake became, over a 6-month period, a work of 5 parts, each directed against a different opponent. And these parts were written as the press had begun printing those parts completed. So each was issued separately with its own title page, or in various combinations, ultimately with a composite title page explaining that the apology was written against the exceptions of Mr. T. Blake and the digressions of Mr. G. Kendall, whereunto are added animadversions on Louis du Moulin and an admonition on Mr. G. Eyre. And he still hadn't finished with an anatomy of a book by Mr. J. Crandon. So in this case, a potential reader might in effect collect the book from the bookseller in installments like a serial, but without knowing that there were going to be further installments Baxter himself didn't know, nor when indeed the set was complete. Another example, Baxter was a constant reviser and expander of his texts. The first 3 editions of his Right Method for a Settled Peace of Conscience in 1653 involved both deletions and additions in response to readers' queries, as he explains in the prefatory material to each edition. he issued a new chapter, included in a subsequent edition of his Saints' Everlasting Rest of 1650, as a separate publication, so that readers who had already bought an edition copy needn't buy the whole book again just for that one chapter. So works sold under the same title might be variously made up, and the parts of books might be sold separately, often with their own title page and a main title, but not always to the same contents. So in cases such as these, it's the reader who makes up their own copy of a title, neither the press nor the author. So the production of texts was a much more informal process than we're used to, with changes in real time. And those changes, the changes in the combination of contents, make the notion of a single text problematic. And there are other kinds of slipperiness. The boundaries between print and handwritten text, for example, can become blurred, as debates often moved between books and letters, with private correspondence sometimes being printed and added to printed copies as the authors exchanged views, leading to various kinds of prelims and appendices included with, but dated after, the main text. Baxter indeed could often preface his prefaces and add addenda to his appendices, as though he couldn't bear to let the reader or the matter go. I just heard about this question, he'll say, or objection, or got this letter, and so I'll add a few further thoughts. That brings us to the issue of paratextual matter more generally. We tend to suppose that this accompanying material is subordinate to what we think of as the main text. But the distinction between main text and supplementary matter is often not easy to maintain in early modern printed books. Baxter's Reliquiae was intent on setting the historical record straight by justifying the Puritan role in 17th century history in response to the triumphalist royalist narratives put out after the restoration of monarchy in 1660. To that end, Baxter was at pains to substantiate his account with primary evidence. Over half the text of his book, in fact, consists of various kinds of supporting documentation. Private letters, printed declarations, manifestos, drafts of published agreements, minutes of meetings, and so on. For Baxter, these were an essential part of the work embedded within the narrative, which was therefore suspended for many pages at a time. The OUP editors have introduced a distinction by separating out the evidential documentation from the original narrative and putting it in distinct volumes. Their argument is that it's still available to the reader to consult, and more easily than in the 1696 folio, while at the same time distinguishing for the reader Baxter's own account of events, which now runs without interruption. But the result is, in fact, a textual presentation that has no authority in either Baxter's manuscript or the 1696 printing. How legitimate is that? How authentic is such a new arrangement of the text? Is reader accessibility a sufficient justification for such a redesign of the presentation of the text? And the OUP editors have included documents not printed in 1696. In his preface, Sylvester rather disarmingly admits that he can't find a paper that was on his desk a minute ago. He doesn't know where it's gone. If it turns up in time, he'll put it in and print it. Well, in that case, he didn't. But some others have subsequently turned up. Are they an intrinsic part of the text? The inclusion of papers omitted by Sylvester and the OUP edition does include them. That's probably legitimate. But the modern editors also include documents that neither Sylvester nor Baxter ever planned to include, some not even directly referenced in the text. Are they encroaching on the author's prerogative? Marginal comments are a particular case of the problems posed by paratextual material. These are very common in 17th century texts, often trying to shape the reader's response, whom they address directly. Bunyan's allegories are a good example. Bunyan supplies biblical references to gloss his allegorical vehicle. They explain the source and the meaning of his imagery, and he often directs the reader's response. Mark this, he says in the margin. Indeed, in the verse preface to the Holy War of 1682, he cautions his reader not to go to work on the allegory without my key. It lies there in the window. And in a fine self-referential moment, there's a marginal comment against window, reading the margin. So the reader is explicitly admonished not to read the text without referring to the marginal glosses and comments. Clearly for Bunyan, the marginalia are an essential part of the text, not an optional extra. But this is problematic. How do you read two texts, the narrative and the commentary, at once? There's a tension between the two discourses, in that the marginal voice is avowedly authorial, the narrative voice is fictional. So the former keeps disturbing the credibility of the latter. The author keeps intruding into his own fiction. For this reason, there have been editions of Pilgrim's Progress that have put the marginalia at the foot of the page, like notes that you can look at or not as you wish, or even at the back, endnotes. Is that legitimate? It's not what Bunyan wanted. Finally, there's censorship. During the 17th century, a system of pre-publication censorship was in operation. It would come to an end in the 18th century, whereby a book required a license to be published, having been read by an approved censor, generally a cleric in the established church. So there were things you couldn't legally get into print, chiefly heterodox theological ideas and subversive political views. This process of licensing often involved the revision of or excisions in texts submitted for license. Baxter repeatedly encountered such demands from the censors. You can't say that, you've got to take that out. We often know when a text has been changed as a condition of publication. Baxter tells us in the Reliquia of many such cases. But then, what are we reading when we read the printed text? There lurks behind what we read an original text that we can't read. And the one that we are reading is, as it were, a collaborative venture of the authors and the censors. And of course, there are texts that we can't read simply because they never made it to the press. Authors wary not only of censorship legislation, but of religious and treason laws might well withhold their works rather than risk fines and imprisonment. It was probably for this reason that the Reliquiae was never offered to the press during Baxter's lifetime. And at his death, Bunyan left over 10 unpublished works. Such unpublished works might be lost from the record, but as in the case of Baxter and Bunyan, they might make it into print posthumously. And this is particularly the case with autobiographical and historical works, withheld because they were politically suspect during the author's lifetime. In the last decades of the 17th century and the first of the 18th, these were often printed in a sort of battle of the books for the master narrative of 17th century history. This is what really happened, I know, because I was there. So we have essentially a campaign appealing to first-hand evidence to determine who was responsible for the civil wars and interregnum. Many of these personal narratives didn't reach print until the 19th century. Lucy Hutchinson, the wife of the regicide John Hutchinson, is a good example. Her memoirs, written in the 1660s, weren't published until 1806. And then only, and this is not untypical, only in a heavily edited text, turning her from an independent woman of forceful Republican and Puritan opinion into a dutiful Victorian housewife. And we know this because her manuscript does survive, so we can see how it was changed, as we can with late 17th century texts like Edmund Ludlow's memoirs. Part of that manuscript survives, and we can see that he was turned into a good Whig by his editor. We can't know how many such texts have gone for good, nor can we tell how much self-censorship by the author has shaped the texts that were published. We can see in the manuscript both Baxter and Sylvester revising the text of the Reliquiae, making deletions and rephrasings, often out of sensitivity about the reception of critical comments about individuals. This raises an interesting question for modern editors. Do we simply ignore what's deleted, or include these passages appropriately distinguished as a record of the history of the text? The OUP edition includes them. The licensing system wasn't very efficient or comprehensive, but it was sufficient to instill caution. And it could lead to a sort of secret discourse shared between writer and reader to oblique writing and reading. Often an inference can be drawn which is not explicit. Vanity Fair in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is a satirical depiction of London society, which all readers would know took its lead from the court of Charles II. When the Lord of Vanity Fair, the prince of this town with all his rabblement of attendants, is identified as Beelzebub, more fit for a being in hell than in this town and country, is there an all but treasonable allusion to Charles II? In the unlicensed Holy War, Charles II shadows Diabolus and his persecuting bloodmen throughout. Is rebellion against Diabolus, although an allegory of resistance to sin, a covert incitement to resistance of Charles II? Baxter's trial for seditious libel in 1685 is another good example. The charge against him, that he denigrated the bishops of the Church of England, turned on the interpretation of his glosses on biblical texts in his paraphrase on the New Testament. It turned into an argument about what he really meant, or what meaning a reader might take from his words. The prosecution alleged that when Baxter spoke of the hypocrite Pharisees and their successors, he was referring to the bishops of the Church of England, that there was an unprinted subtext, that Baxter was dealing in a sort of code. It was no good for Baxter to say he was for bishops, or for his defence team to point out a place where he said those truly called bishops deserved respect. The notorious Judge Jeffreys harangued him from the bench. Baxter for bishops, That's a merry conceit indeed. This is your Presbyterian cant, himself and such rascals set apart by such factious snivelling Presbyterians as himself, a Kidderminster bishop, he means. Kidderminster was the parish where Baxter served with distinction during the interregnum. So what is in a printed text, what it presents, is finally a matter for the reader, a matter of interpretation, not of what is there, but of what the context of composition and publication implies is there. A meaning, in other words, that is not in print at all. Thank you very much. With that, I will hand over to Tessa and the 18th century.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, for this very rich presentation, which is, I think, precisely what we need here in looking at mise en texte and what we think of as a text today. That reminds us of a very complex process of collaboration between author, press, editor, reader, and censor, and of course on the role as well of textual editors today. And I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about it later on. So our second speaker tonight is Tessa Whitehouse. Tessa is senior lecturer in 18th century English at Queen Mary University of London and director of the centre that I've mentioned previously, the Queen Mary Centre for Religion and Literature in English. She is the author of Textual Culture of English Protestant Descent, 1720 to 1800, and here again, there you go, this is it here. And she is co-editor of Textual Transformations, OUP 2019. There you go. This one is in the box at home. Thank you. Because I'm moving out. I'm not saying that the text is actually in the box, but I'm moving out flats tomorrow morning. So I was able to grab a couple, but not all of them. So Tessa, you edited Textual Transformations. Also recently a volume of IREA, at Lerma, reconstructing early modern religious lives, the exemplary and the mundane. And I believe the last one, Religion and Life Cycles in Early Modern England for Manchester University Press, and that's 2021. So Tessa, it's to you. And I believe you want to share your screen.
Yes, I'm just going to start now. Thanks, Anne. I'm just going to share my screen, and can you tell me how that looks? So okay.
That's
okay.
Absolutely fine. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anne, and thank you for that introduction, and also for Neil for setting up the session in such a great way to highlight our view that processes of editing and revising and textual reproduction are often social and collaborative in both positive and negative ways rather than individual, and also involve personal relationships as much as professional ones. And that's the aspect of this that I'm going to focus on. And thank you, of course, also to Laurence for the invitation to Neil and I to reflect further on the arguments that we've both made in print. For example, in that volume you just saw, Textual Transformations, which I co-edited with Neil, that making and remaking processes cross and blur the boundary between manuscript and print. In this talk, I'm going to talk about three patterns of textual transformation. First of all, the movement from small format, inexpensive individual publications to a grand multi-volume collected works of a single author. Then secondly, printed works that at first relate to and serve quite restricted audiences and contexts, but which have the scope of their reactions, have the scope of their reception dramatically widened in subsequent versions. And finally, the third type of textual transformation I'm going to look at very briefly is private papers written by women that undergo authorized posthumous publication. And to do that, I'm hoping to highlight some aspects of the editing and reception of dissenters' books.
Sorry to interrupt, Tessa, just for a second. There seems to be quite a lot of white noise when you speak, and I think it's probably you turning the pages actually next to your microphone. Could it be that?
Maybe. Is that?
Yeah, that's much better. So
okay.
I know there's no easy way to do that, but if you can just turn the pages a little bit away from the computer microphone, that might help. Sorry about that.
Yep, sure. What am I trying to say? So I'm thinking about dissenters' religious books, particularly cross-genre texts that are religious and in terms of being educational, literary and devotional in the 18th century. And all three kinds of transformation that I'm going to be talking about today are animated by faith and friendship and legacy building aims. And I'm hoping to emphasize the human tendencies that drove publication, but which also could delay and complicate it, the sort of give and take and sense of personal obligation to an individual and a wider community and emotional bonds, the part those aspects play. Dissenting writers and readers of books and manuscripts and listeners to sermons and to letters and to books read aloud imagined themselves as intimates deeply connected through bonds of faith and history and shared experience. Neil has written about how friendship was a positive force in securing fragile traditions of nonconformity in the later 17th century, when he wrote in the literary culture of nonconformity. If this forcible dismemberment of the nonconformist body through legislation and through persecution was not to prove mortal, it was crucial that a sense of fellowship, of belonging to a community, be maintained among individuals, however long they might be separated or widely scattered. People in adversity have need of friends, but when membership of a church has directly caused that adversity, for it then to fail the sufferer would make a mockery of the sacrifice. As Neil reminds us, we must keep in mind the deep ethical and social significance of textual reception in dissenting culture and the role of friendship in articulating and sustaining this. In circumstances of persecution and political pressure, friendship was vital to the continuation of the traditions collectively labelled as nonconformist, and this remained the case as active persecution modulated into toleration from 1689. Religious dissenters continued to be excluded from the mainstream of civic life, and they could not know when the tide might turn against them once more. Perpetuating their traditions through literature and personal ties continued to be a significant project, as it had been for earlier generations in the way that Neil was just describing. One of the key figures to shape dissenters' engagement with texts and their sense of their own history and future was the Congregationalist or Independent minister Isaac Watts. You can see here. Watts was born in 1764, so in penal times, and his father was repeatedly imprisoned for nonconformity, including during the year of his birth. So the defining image of Watts's infancy in all biographies is of his mother nursing baby Isaac on the steps of Southampton jail. He was educated for the dissenting ministry in London and served the congregation at Mark Lane, which was home to the descendants of the Cromwell family and was formerly ministered by John Owen. As a poet and hymnotist, well, particularly as a hymnodist, Watts transformed religious worship across the Anglophone world. And in the 19th and 20th century biographies of him styled him the father of English hymnody. And in fact, that's where his name is most likely to be known today. People who spend time in British or North American churches singing his hymns like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross or O God Our Help in Ages Past, which remain devotional staples sung across denominations, as I can attest, having a Catholic upbringing but very familiar with those hymns. In his lifetime too, he sought to sustain the traditions of his own community while extending the hand of friendship across oceans, languages and denominational affiliations. And so in his lifetime and immediately afterwards, his reputation was a rounded one as a religious man of letters and not exclusively as a hymn writer. So I'm going to start off by talking about Watts's own collected works. Watts had long anticipated his death, and when it finally came, his financial and literary affairs were well in order. In his will, he appointed Nathaniel Neal and Enoch Watts, his brother, his literary executors. He authorised the sale of his copyright to James Waugh for £600 and named Philip Doddridge and David Jennings as his chosen editors. He explained where to find his unpublished papers. He gave the editors freedom to do what they wanted with them, but stipulated that such as shall be published may have the attestation of their names prefixed to satisfy the world they are genuine. So securing a credible literary legacy was important to Watts, and he hoped to achieve it by associating his posthumously published writings with the names of two of his respectable ministerial associates. The collected works that was published 5 years after his death in 6 Crown quarto volumes is a substantial monument to a well-known and prolific author, which encompasses the full range of his writings. There's sermons and addresses, essays and educational texts, hymns and poetry. As David Jennings put it in the short biographical account which prefaced the first volume, I question whether any author before him did ever appear with reputation on such a variety of subjects as he has done, both as a prose writer and a poet. It's a publication very similar to the images you see on the right of the screen here, which are from the works of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Tillotson. So the format with this engraved frontispiece portrait, the grand ruled title page, and other paratextual equipment of the two works are remarkably similar. But it's quite striking that in 2022, it's much easier to find the trace of this Anglican work than the dissenting equivalent. And in fact, this one that you see here is available for £150 via the Oxfam online bookshop, if anyone's interested in picking up a copy, whereas there aren't any copies of the Watts works for sale on the open market, as far as I can see. So we might say that the transformation of Watts into this sort of monumental shape doesn't really reflect how he was known and accessed in the 18th and 19th century. Books like this are much more typical, small format, well-travelled, heavily used. So there's a gap between Watts's reputation as it lived on in the ears and the memories of children and working adults as they attended the meeting house and Sunday schools that his works really associated with, and that grand collection of volumes as the collected works. So what was that edition trying to do? To answer this, I want to relate Watts's works to the development of collected editions of other authors at the time. For the editors and booksellers were drawing on traditions specific to collected works to convey the posthumous figure of Isaac Watts. Those traditions had developed to accommodate the professional writings of theologians, lawyers, philosophers, and medical writers, rather than practical religious writers and poets. The existence and appearance of collected works is a variety of authors at mid-century, among them Watts, but also including John Tillotson, as you saw, Catherine Cockburn-Trotter, Jonathan Swift, and Alexander Pope, provides evidence of a literary culture that's emerging of monumental authorship that includes authors now from other kinds of authorship. A national canon of literature was emerging through diverse modes of critical editing, and it wasn't always a straightforward process. Marcus Walsh has written about this, noting, I quote, editorial activity in the 18th century must be seen in the light of contested practices, constructions, and representations of learning, scholarship, and reading. And Watts is a transitional figure in a cultural shift away from those professional collected works towards sort of more belletristic collections of complete works. And within those wider cultural shifts, Watts's editors and literary executors are conducting specific negotiations with each other relating to Watts's own writing. A few months after Watts's death, David Jennings had identified just one manuscript which required attention in order to include it in the works alongside previously published pieces, the second part of The Improvement of the Mind, the first part of which had been published in 1741 as a kind of textbook in Lockean ideas for students, which was quickly incorporated into the teaching at dissenting academies and colleges at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The second part of The Improvement of the Mind, however, in 1748 was in no way ready for publication. Nathaniel Neal was of the opinion that it is in all respects imperfect in matter and form. It wants to be digested, in some parts reduced, in others it may be enlarged, in all methodized, connected and polished. We don't have Doddridge's reply to this list of tasks, but we know he wrote to his friend Samuel Clarke saying, "How I shall prepare for the press the second volume of Dr. Watts's Improvement of the Mind, I cannot imagine." And he asked Clarke to help him. Over the course of a few years, anyway, this work was done and the works were published. It's clear from these epistolary interactions that the men felt their sense of responsibility to Watts's memory and legacy in terms of their consciousness of the obligations of personal friendship, which encompassed a sense of one writer's place in a circle of fellow ministers and in a tradition of dissenting writers. The needs of their community at large are also felt, and when it comes to collected works like Watts's, the future prestige of the community is part of that. The presence of the wider dissenting community, the financially and socially elite part of it at least, is registered in the volumes themselves in the list of 136 subscribers. So that monumental collected works is one kind of memorial project. Although the resulting publication was rather different from the formats and print runs of Watts's works published separately, the process of communal endeavour and the goal of addressing different audiences within a single publication resonates with Watts's work in his own lifetime. I'm going to take one example of that as the second kind of textual transformation, because Watts did a great deal of work, including editing, recommending, and distributing the works of others. And this print activity often came about because of personal relationships, many of which were sustained through letters. Watts presented collaborative efforts within the dissenting ministerial community and with like-minded religious associates in Germany and New England. He helped shape a community of godly learning through prefaces and recommendations to books, and that was part of his project to connect audiences in different religious and social groups and different nationalities using print. Thanks to his high reputation in his lifetime and afterwards, the advice he gave about reading significantly shaped transatlantic intellectual life in the 18th century. So I'm going to talk about a small book called Two Discourses, which has received very little scholarly attention, but it was considered by its promoters to be very important. It crossed denominational and national boundaries, and over numerous editions, it grew to contain instructive prefaces, letters, and a biographical narrative, as well as the discourses of the title. The writings began life as lectures on practical religion, delivered to the students at John Jennings's Dissenting Academy in the East Midlands of England at the end of the 1710s and early 1720s. Jennings's student, Philip Doddridge, one of the editors of Watts's collected works, recalled how one Friday in every month, students and tutors would unite in a day of prayer, fasting, and contemplation in preparation for the Lord's Supper that Sunday. At 10 o'clock, they would gather in the chapel. After some time spent in the offices of devotion, Mr. Jennings gave us a lecture from the pulpit on some topic which was peculiarly suitable to us as students. These he composed with great care and exactness. The incomparable discourses of preaching Christ and of experimental preaching which he published to the world just before his death were drawn up and preached on such occasions. In Doddridge's account, the printed text emerges out of community religious practice, which it also sustains. Watts took an interest in this book and provided a preface directed towards ministers, which explains that the discourses could be useful beyond their first setting, because, if, as Watts puts it, if in the middle age of life we should examine our performances by the light of this treatise, 'tis possible we and our people might be the gainers by it. This is characteristic of Watts, the recommender of books. He resituates the work spatially and temporally, here imagining the educative function of the text reaching beyond the dissenting academy in which it began. So here you can see three versions of this text that we're talking about. Watts had international ambitions for the project of reforming preaching in order to benefit the laity. He sent copies of two discourses to many correspondents, including an influential minister in Boston called Benjamin Colman, and the German pietist minister Gotthilf August Franke, son of August Hermann Franke, the founder of the widely famed charitable institutions at Halle, in Germany. In return, Franke sent a copy of a letter on preaching written by his father, which David Jennings, brother of John Jennings and the other editor of Isaac Watts's works, translated into English and included in a new edition of Two Discourses published in 1736, the one you see in the middle of the screen. In an additional advertisement to this new edition, Watts emphasizes the familial and social ties connecting the different materials contained in the book. His advertisement and Jennings's preface foreground the eager reception of the original edition in Scotland and Germany, which serves to demonstrate that work has multiple centres of influence connected by print trade networks of import and export, distribution through sale and gift, and the activities of individuals to promote each work to a new audience. The paratexts highlight instances of small-scale endeavours within communities with strong familial and affectionate connections, which, though small, spread the influence of ideas internationally. Readers participated in the collaborative exchange of the work which the paratexts encouraged. The respective translations of Franca and David Jennings generated a series of book exchanges between London and Halle. The circle widened yet further when Watts sent copies of this 1736 edition to Benjamin Coleman in Boston and requested one of the copies be given to Harvard College. Coleman took this as a cue to publish a fresh edition of the work in Boston, to which he added paratexts of his own. A statement describing the range of books donated by Watts to New England colleges, and an abridgment of a biography of Cotton Mather written by his son and introduced by David Jennings. The addition of this text consolidates the themes and aims of the earlier versions. Across many reprints, in 3 significantly revised versions and in different countries, 2 discourses acted as a site for publicising religious projects. Overlapping cultures of publishing, friendship and news brought events and texts, writers, readers and listeners from Northern Europe, the British Isles and North America into contact. Similar cultures of friendship and publishing are at play in the 3rd type of transformation too. So who am I talking about here? The key figure is Elizabeth Singer Rowe, one of the best-known, most popular poets and prose writers of her times, an unusual figure whose early work appeared in print in the 1690s and who then married a dissenting minister. She was widowed early and favoured a life of retirement in rural Somerset. She was long-time friends with Isaac Watts and indeed Benjamin Coleman too. The 2 other women whose published works I'm going to introduce very briefly are Elizabeth Berry on the left of the screen and Martha Gerrish, the former an English wife of a minister, the latter a woman from a commercial family in Boston whose published writings are contemporaneous with Rowe's final publication. These 3 writers give us a window into the presentation strategies used by male promoters of women's writing in print and help us to get a sense of the ways in which women's manuscripts were transformed for public use in this tradition. So here's Elizabeth Rowe, who died in 1737. And in the next letter, Isaac Watts wrote to their mutual friend in Boston, Benjamin Coleman, Watts said, "The ingenious and pious Mrs. Rowe of Frome died about 2 months ago. She has left many papers, some devotional ones, in prose chiefly, are by her letter, a little before she died, committed to me for publication." 6 months later, he announced the imminent publication of these papers as devout exercises of the heart and gave an update to Coleman about the ongoing legacy work around Rowe. So I'm not going to read this quotation, but what activities does Rowe describe here? Printed obituaries composed by friends were being gathered up along with Rowe's own writings. These materials would, the men involved believed, facilitate the posthumous construction of the author's reputation. This work of compilation was done by family connections and friends of Rowe's who shared in her religious tradition, rather than her friends from the religious establishment. On the 28th of September 1736, 3 days after composing her will and 5 months before her death, Rowe wrote to her brother-in-law, Theophilus Rowe, presenting him with her unpublished letters and poetry and instructing him in how they should be published. In the final months of her life, she prepared further letters that blended spiritual reflection and exhortation with practical instructions. Several of these were later printed. Rowe's own efforts to manage the posthumous publication of her writings and her attempt to shape her reception became part of her authorial legacy. Her editors followed the example Rowe set by publishing letters to her from friends alongside those she'd written herself. The importance of publishing letters to set good examples and to establish pious literary exemplarity was a crucial aspect of Rowe's posthumous public appearance that she herself guided. It's a rare instance when we have evidence of male readers adapting their own publishing practices to accommodate the prior work done by a woman. Indeed, we might say in this case they were guided by it. One effect in this case is to situate Rowe in a literary community that isn't identical to her religious one. Friendship both determined a text's content and shaped publication processes in order to secure the posthumous reputation of an author and align a work's reception with its readers' expectations. And this, as we've already seen this afternoon, was often not an easy process. Watts felt the burden of friendship weighing heavily upon him as he prepared the devout exercises of the heart for publication. He wrote to Benjamin Coleman, "I cannot but say 'twas a piece of nice and dangerous work put into my hands to recommend a book to the world wherein I knew some expressions would awaken the ridicule of the age." It's almost as though Watts seems to suspect he was given the task precisely because it was a difficult one, and as a close and long-standing friend, Rowe knew he'd feel obliged to accept her request. His high profile would legitimize the orthodoxy of the ideas and expression in a work that might otherwise run the risk of being received with derision. In the preface to the printed edition, Watts also signalled his concerns about the text and included a transcription of Rowe's final wishes communicated to him in that deathbed letter. This paratext underscored the obligations of friendship that had occasioned the publication. In Rowe and Watts, we have the opportunity to compare the testamentary acts of two self-confident literary writers in the dissenting tradition who wanted to ensure a public legacy for themselves. Both Rowe and Watts were proactive in directing their posthumous appearances in print. There are differences in how that worked in practice, though. When Rowe's collected works were published, they were smaller in format than Watts's, their octavo, and the collection contained material by other hands, including her husband and several friends. Her legacy and reception were packaged with her writing. Poems written to her were published there and further added to in later editions, in contrast to the absence of commemorative materials in Watts's works. Rowe's works place her within her community, which is quite an ecumenical one, whereas Watts's works physically seek to place him in new company among monumental authors in a gentleman's library. However, it's the smaller, separately published works of his that show the deep and ongoing community engagement that's so important to all these dissenting writers. And that's the point I'd like to take forward briefly, just to consider these final two writers, Berry and Gerrish, to sketch the gendered dimensions of writing within and for a religious community, as informal, personal writings are transformed into printed books. The line of communication or influence here isn't a direct one, but the presence of Watts plays a mediating role. So Elizabeth Berry was commemorated in a printed funeral sermon to which many extracts from her letters and diaries were added, along with an elegiac poem by Watts. Samuel Berry listed the variety of Berry's surviving papers that he had edited, listing secret memoirs and her solemn transactions, self-dedication, spiritual reflections, profitable remarks, her peculiar regards to the various occurrences of life, and special charges to herself and others. And this conveys the numerous related genres of life writing that were commonly found in the papers of women writing in this Puritan tradition. And it's very similar to the range of genres found in Rowe's devout exercises of the heart. Writing that was rooted in reading and self-reflection became, when circulated among family and later published, a tool for widespread spiritual improvement. Correspondence was particularly important in this as a mode of personal writing that was prized as a powerful means of pastoral counsel. Letters worked alongside oral advice to reinforce doctrinal message, is to model and encourage powerful modes of spiritual reflection, and to assert the strength of those communities that are facing persecution. Women's letters in print offered a model of literary production for future writers, partly through their content and partly through their association with pious women, whose piety in a mutually reinforcing circularity was confirmed by the content of the letters. And it's here that Watts carries us from Berry, who lived through penal times and into toleration in England, to Gerrish, for Watts's elegy on Berry, published at the end of her volume of writings, was reproduced as the epigraph to Martha Gerrish's published correspondence in the following decade, in the 1730s. And you see some lines from that in the middle here. And this epigraph registers a direct connection between Puritan and nonconformist women's texts published in England and America that reinforces the similarities between memorial texts across the Atlantic. It makes a thematic and spiritual connection between Berry and Gerrish, who were not known to each other personally. And you see the movement from contemplation to writing in Gaze and Transcribe underscores the active nature of pursuing a life of piety by following good examples. And the collective benefits of this approach indicated by the flow of virtue from the singular Berry to the plural matrons, who will observe the biographical details of her life and the beauties of her mind evident in her writing, and activate those models in their own writing. Gerrish's letters do that. They provide a pattern of excellence, of religious purpose, and Benjamin Coleman praised her style elsewhere as masculine and polite. Her letters, like Berry's, contain evidence of her intellectual activity and guidance to the recipients. The active reading she requires of her correspondence promises spiritual improvements akin to those that she herself has experienced through the act of writing, and the mutually beneficial effects of the epistolary process are further amplified by printing correspondence. 18th century women writers like Berry and Gerrish, who rooted their literary practices in religious belief and communities of faith, did so not as late witnesses to a fading tradition of Puritanism that's dying out, but as participants in a vibrant transatlantic literary culture rooted in its recent past. As Neil and I have both discussed, nonconformists and dissenters were strongly motivated by a desire to preserve and perpetuate their distinctive traditions. In this context, posterity is not only about securing the reputation of individual exemplary writers. Friends left alive are required to take on new roles governed by tradition to faithfully publish the manuscripts they've been left and act as engaged guardians of the reputations of individual writers and the dissenting tradition more widely understood. A crucial way of doing this was to forge connections internationally and use letters and print to demonstrate the piety and literary skill of dissenting men and women. And I've finished there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tessa, for continuing the discussion with those transatlantic case studies, reminding us once again of the importance of networks of friends in nonconformist circle, forging the legacy of those posthumous texts, as we've seen before with Matthew Silvester forging the fortune of Richard Baxter, and indeed producing an entirely new text. And then you turn to the gender dimension of that tradition as well, on which I'm sure you'll have much to say later on. And thank you also, because I thought that your papers answered each other so beautifully with letters and life writing, as well as other genres, on which I'm sure there are going to be a great many questions. So by my clock, it's 17:40. So I suggest we take just a 5-minute break, and we reconvene at 17, or for you 16:45, for a series of questions. And in the meantime, we can go and have a short break. We'll be back shortly. Thank you very much to both of you. Please feel free right now to turn your cameras back on. For this question, it's a bit more convivial to actually see everybody. So those of you who want to, don't hesitate to do that, please. So as I said earlier, either you can ask your question in person, as it were, or you can put it in the chat for Neil, Tessa, or both of them. So I know it's always a little bit difficult to start, but please feel free. Somebody's got to do it. So if you have one, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'll start. But it's probably better if it came from one of you. Who would like to start? Anybody? Yes, Laurence, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for really stimulating papers and for insights into something that we rarely really get to see together. I mean, we do take for granted the fact that the copy we have in front of us is pretty much similar to the one that our neighbours may be looking at in a different library, and obviously that is not the case, as Neil and Tessa as well just pointed out. I have a question which is purely factual, but I was wondering whether you could perhaps enlighten me as to how do we know there are no author's copy at all of a particular book? Do we have an idea of these copies existing in particular archives or particular specialist libraries, maybe being owned by private families? And for those private collections, how do we go about having an idea of what's there and what isn't?
Shall I'll have a go at that first, Tessa, shall I? I think the short answer, Lawrence, is that we don't know. They may well be lurking somewhere, and as you'll know, manuscripts do from time to time turn up in the most extraordinary way. The Baxter edition I was involved with, it took over 10 years, and we don't have all Baxter's manuscript, but throughout the process of editing it, we kind of lived in fear that someone's going to find something down the back of a radiator and say, oh, look what I've... So I think the answer is we don't know. But we do know the practice was to destroy them if they went into print. So your chances are higher if you're dealing with a text that wasn't printed. So texts like the Lucy Hutchinson that I mentioned, that wasn't printed until the 19th century, that was indeed, as you conjectured, that was kept in the family. And a number of diaries survived in this way. They were passed on within the family. And that happened, of course, particularly in nonconformist families when one of their members had been an eminent minister. Manuscripts of sermons and meditations and so on would be retained, and subsequent members of the family might indeed add their own wee jottings, you know. Oh yes, I was thinking this about that, that's quite... So the short answer is we don't know. We do know the usual practice was to destroy them when they're printed, but we can live in hope.
Thank you very much, Neil. Tessa?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Yes, of course, I just agree with everything Neil says about works that were intended for publication. So I guess I would just add a note about the importance in all traditions, but I suppose I'm thinking particularly about the dissenting tradition of books that weren't intended for print publication. You know, so also trying to destabilize this hierarchy of printed books being more significant or more important. That it's quite what Samuel Berry did with Elizabeth Berry's diaries and letters is very unusual, but circulating women's life writings more informally was not unusual at all, and was a practice that carried on, you know, well into the 19th century, that people would make very fair copies. They'd borrow a diary, they'd make extracts for themselves, they'd copy out bits of letters in a way that Samuel Berry does in his memorials of his wife. That's quite an unusual, I think, quite a rare insight into what was a very active and lively and creative manuscript cultural practice for centuries. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. There is.
Can I just
yeah,
add a footnote? This is an edition published by Vera Camden quite recently of exactly what we're talking about, Mary Franklin and Hannah Burton. These are family manuscripts originating with a minister and passed down through the generations, retained in the family, and she has edited them wonderfully. It's called She Being Dead Yet Speaketh, the Franklin Family Papers. So there's a wonderful example of exactly what we're talking about, and they did survive. But of course, they weren't intended for publication.
Thank you very much.
Alison has just put a link in the chat for those of you who want to have a look at it, of Hester Filter's manuscripts at the Brotherton Library, a lovely royalist parallel to Hutchinson. So you've got that in the chat, everybody. I believe can see that. Any other questions in the meantime? Yes, Isabel, please. You need to
unmute.
That's it.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. I just saw the cross across it. Yeah, I wanted to think about spreading this out a bit, particularly, I suppose, in relation to Tessa's account of Watts, which is very, very interesting. But the thing that strikes me is, I mean, I think your focus was primarily on transatlantic dissenting sort of relationships of your talk. And Watts primarily is thought of as a dissenter. I mean, it seems to me really very important to realize that very early on, Watts is taken out of the dissenting milieu. I mean, the first line of the hymn that has God our help in ages past in it was changed in the Wesleyan version. Watts's version is our God, our help in ages past. The Wesleyan version, which is, I think, the one that has come to dominate, is, oh God, our help in ages past. I don't know if that's the one you, Tessa, when you were saying with your Catholic background, you sang that hymn, I think you said, or you knew that hymn. Were you singing oh God or our God? Well, you probably don't remember.
Oh God, definitely.
Oh God, well, that's the Wesleyan version. I mean, one of the things, I mean, I did a great deal of work on tracing what happens in hymn books, but the interesting thing is people who cease to be thought of as belonging to a particular denomination. And I think that's really important with Watts. I mean, obviously, if we look in Watts in his own time and the stories about Watts that are stressed, you know, like the imprisonment of his father and so on, but he becomes, you know, he turns up in all sorts of hymnals. He turns up in Anglican hymnals. I mean, very much in the 19th century for Anglican ones. But, you know, and he also gets his theology completely turned upside down. I mean, if you look at Unitarian hymn books that have Watts's hymns in them, he would, I mean, that is, I suppose, still there's a dissenting tradition, but it's a dissenting tradition he would have been appalled by. And there are his hymns with most of the theology of Watts really travestied. And I think this idea that Neil was talking about, how do you control the text? Well, I mean, this goes on and on and on because they get rewritten and reshaped for different purposes. And quite often, it seems to me, people might not know, as I'm sure Unitarian singers of Watts's hymns might not have realized what travesties they were singing.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. That's certainly, I think that's true. And I think that Watts, as the writer of hymns, has quite a different and very long, well, still going on kind of reception across all denominations, as we were saying. And the kind of prose writings and community-based writings that I was talking about have quite a different, much more limited circulation. So the people who are reading and engaging with those know Watts the hymn writer and they kind of appreciate his fame, but they're thinking about him as a member of a not strictly dissenting community, but you know, a kind of Calvinist or Puritan tradition community. And so I suppose, as you would say too, that we have to think about the kinds of texts and books that are traveling around and the different directions they take, and what's his sermons and educational writings and the works that he recommended have quite a different life to his hymns. And I think that's one of the reasons that his collected works isn't very successful, because people aren't necessarily interested in the whole Watts. You know, they've got the bits of Watts that they like, and that's the bit that they'll keep reading.
Thank you. Neil, do you want to add something on this topic? Or
Well, listening to that, I was just thinking in my own period of the example of Milton, The text doesn't undergo quite so much change, but the presentation of it does enormously. The prose works are presented as though he belonged to a political tradition that didn't exist when he was alive. His republicanism, his enthusiasm, and so on are muted, and he becomes a Whig politician in the prose works because of the editorial matter. But the poetry, still more obviously, is presented as, we now think of it, an English classic, and it is divorced from the kind of context that led to its creation, the sorts of contexts we've been talking about. So in both these cases, the prose and the poetry, they are removed from what gave them their shape, their form, and their purpose, in order that they might be read in a different way. You can read Paradise Lost without being worried about Milton the Republican, and you can read the prose works without being worried about that as well.
Thank you. And I suppose a good example also would be Bunyan. I see that Natalie Collet, who's here, has worked quite a lot on this reappropriation, quite obviously outside dissenting or nonconformist circle very early on. Any other question? Right. I would have, well, I have a couple, but perhaps one more directed to Neil, even though Tessa, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about that as well. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about censorship that you mentioned at this process of transforming texts. And I was particularly interested in that idea of how to interpret things, as if there were almost a kind of subliminal message in everything that Baxter was writing. And at some point, he goes to the Bishop of London's chaplain that said, well, whatever you write, we're not going to give you a license. Then he goes to the Archbishop of London chaplain, and at some point he says something like, well, you're not going to license the Bible anymore if it's just proper interpretation. So I just wanted you to say a little bit more about that, perhaps.
That's a very good remark to recollect, because it turns upon the point I was trying to make. It turns on interpretation. And when they did indeed say to Baxter once, when he said, for goodness sakes, how am I ever going to get anything published? And they more or less said, well, you're not, because everybody knows what you mean. And he did indeed say, as you've reminded us, well, on that argument, if you're going to rely on people's personal opinion of a text, you wouldn't publish the Bible. So there was a difficulty, certainly, for people like Baxter who achieved a certain standing. And the difficulty didn't really have directly to do often with what they wanted to print. It had to do with the idea, or the supposition, or the fear that they had a subversive intention, which we must remember, certainly after 1660 and for the next 10, even 20 years, the restored regime was very apprehensive. It saw plots everywhere, and they were terribly anxious that any suggestion of an idea that could unsettle the newly restored regime should be resisted. And the unsettling, of course, included the established church, the church and the government being hand in glove. So it having been known that Baxter had Puritan opinions, that he had applauded Richard Cromwell, it was thought, clearly this man is not to be trusted. And so a malign interpretation from the point of view of the establishment is the one that you can suppose is lurking in his texts. As I mentioned, we know that as a result, he left a number of things out. of a number of texts. But you refer also to this more interesting case of texts that we don't know what's happened to them. We have the text, and we might suppose that the author has, him or less often herself, tried to circumvent the censors. There are one or two wonderful examples of this in pamphlet literature, where the writer just makes fun of Roger Lestrange, who ran the censorship network, teasing him, saying, well, you can't get me, can you? And so on. But there are subtler ways of avoiding the censorship, which did indeed involve implying things that weren't said. Now, in what is increasingly the old days, the days of Christopher Hill, this was much thought about. Christopher Hill suspected that pretty well any radical or Puritan text was actually saying something indirectly. I think we now feel that I was probably overdoing it a bit. And Hill also thought that it was when censorship collapsed that everybody started publishing radical ideas. And I think we now think that censorship was really never quite that effective. But nevertheless, I think it is certainly the case that there is some reason for the censor's suspicion that there's something going on that they can't quite get hold of. So I think Martin Zelzenis has a book in hand on restoration censorship, and it may well be that something of this will be explored in that. So I think I'm trying to say, yes, there is a subtext, but on the other hand, we shouldn't overdo it.
Thank you. Tessa, do you?
Yeah, I just have a couple of thoughts. They're not really related to this, the sort of structures of censorship that Neil was talking about, where the stakes are really high, aren't they, in political terms and in terms of individual liberty, you know, physical liberty as well as intellectual liberty. But thinking more about the other aspect of censorship you were talking about, Neil, in your paper, about that sort of line between being an editor and censoring or self-censoring the subject that you're presenting in print. And one of the very clear examples is the way, when it comes to putting life writings into print, is how editors were very conscious of the requirements of decorum or privacy, for instance. So they did things that drive us mad now, like in the case of Elizabeth Berry's letters, taking away the dates they were written, who they were written to, where they were written from. Any of that kind of contextual information that we would love is gone. And that carries on even into the 19th century, as Isabel has talked about to me very often. Philip Doddridge's 19th century editors, who would put different bits of letters together and take personal information out or completely change it around. And those practices are quite, the rationale behind those practices, I think, is very opaque to us now, because we live in a different culture, a culture with very different editorial priorities. So thinking back to what those earlier editors of even earlier writers were trying to do is really complex, and Lucy Hutchinson is another great example of that, of course.
I think you're right. I think in many ways, changing taste has more of an effect on the presentation of texts than direct political anxiety or subversiveness. Baxter can give us a lovely example, because when they came to publish the Reliquiae, Matthew Sylvester was very, and Calame was very worried by the way Baxter would go on endlessly about all his illnesses and the way his digestion was working. And they really didn't think this was appropriate. By the time you reach the 1690s, we need some decorum, we need some restraint, and funny dreams and all this kind of thing. So I think you're right that the shaping of text has probably got as much to do with changes of taste and expectation what it is appropriate in a particular genre to share with a reader, as more than anything else. Yeah.
Yes, and actually just to follow up on that really briefly, in the case of Elizabeth Rowe's Devout Exercises of the Heart, for instance, that Watts was so worried about her highfalutin and intensely emotional expressiveness that he sort of gave some tips on how to read her in a proper way in the preface, but in fact his worries were not founded, and the book was really popular, and Isabel's written about this in Vanity Fair and the Celestial City, that in fact maybe it was precisely that idiosyncrasy that Watts was so worried about that made the text so appealing, and that was really very popular right through the 19th century in lots of formats as well.
Thank you. And carrying on that notion of taste, Alison's just put a question in the chat. How significant is the material packaging, paratextual construction of the books, whether poetry or prose, to the development and transformation of taste across the period discussed? I'm thinking a bit about Ben Jonson's folio works in the early 17th century and how it might connect with Watts' complete works as a project, for example.
Yeah, well, thanks, Alison. Hello. I think I had condensed my things about Watts's works quite a lot, but yes, my idea with those works is that it was definitely the endeavor was to get them into private libraries, gentlemanly libraries, and to have them kind of there for consultation as reference works, as much as, you know, hymns that you had off by heart and would happily sing out. And the question of taste is a really tricky one, particularly thinking about the 18th century and literary taste in the era before Romantic poetry, for instance, and the kinds of things that were thought to be in good taste in terms of language and writing, a bit as Neil was just talking about with the things that got left out of the reliquiae. And Philip Doddridge, who we've already mentioned, and Watts were positioned after their deaths, but also positioned themselves as people who were trying to make dissent seem polite, but not too polite, not losing too much of its kind of essential oppositional character, I suppose. So I think it's quite an uneasy position for Watts to be in, and again, that's maybe one of the reasons that the works didn't particularly take, is that he's not thought of in that way. And Donald Davy puts it really well, actually, when he's talking about Watts's hymns and how can we know the effect of Watts's language and his imagery over the centuries of millions of people singing those hymns in a way that isn't quantifiable in terms of print runs even, or people mentioning that they knew the text, the way that his words are so deeply embedded in people's memories, and the images are kind of part of their common language, which we see often in, say, deathbed accounts. People will talk through Watts. They're not even consciously necessarily reciting Watts, they're just using his words kind of woven into their own conversations. So yeah, so I think, as Isabel and I were saying as well just now, that it's kind of tricky with Watts, and that he definitely does contribute to ideas of taste and literary genius, but maybe not through the paratextual packaging of those works in the way that he obviously wanted them to be like that, and that his editors and executors were trying to obey his wishes in that way.
Thank you. Neil, I don't know if you want
to... just one thought I have, which is that pretty clearly in traditions that are not generally accepted or regarded as respectable, there's pretty clear evidence in book production of them trying to present themselves as though they are part of a cultural mainstream. Even the word used on collected title pages, the works of, is telling the reader something about the status of whatever it is that is in this text. And I think that that formulation is used, the works of so-and-so, probably more often than something like the collected sermons of so-and-so. And particularly in the 1690s, there's a whole swathe of publications in large folios of dissenting writers. And these folios, if you saw them on a library shelf, they would look indistinguishable when they're bound, of course, in leather and so on. They would look indistinguishable from good, decent, honest, upright Episcopalian gents like Tillotson. So, so I think that's a thought that there is a kind of crossover there in the packaging, if you will, of texts.
Thank you. Moving on to another question, Jan Brzezilovsky. I was wondering to what extent nonconformist publishers influence textual practices of mainstream publishers, composition, editorial interventions, paratext, etc., especially in the late 17th century before the elapsing of the Licensing Act. Who wants to start?
I think Neil should answer that question.
I'll have a shot. The short answer is I can't answer it, I'm afraid. I think it would need quite a lot of detailed work and examination of the output of particular booksellers. The only thought that comes into my mind is that nonconformist booksellers later in the 17th century clearly become significant in the book trade in a way that they hadn't before. Parkhurst is the obvious example. And so they have a standing which they didn't have before, and therefore their practices are indeed likely to be influential. But I'm afraid I can't adduce any particular examples of that. So just a general thought that, yes, they probably did have a shaping effect on the book trade.
Thank you, Tessa.
Yeah, I don't have any answer at all in terms of the textual practices, I'm afraid, but just to note kind of along the lines of what Neil was saying, and that Isabel has done so much work on that, particularly as copyright ownership practices started to change and groups of publishers would have shares in copyrights together, then having dissenting booksellers for dissenting writers and establishment booksellers for establishment writers became less of a firm division, I would say, as time went on over the 18th century. And for instance, the Rivingtons had shares in Philip Doddridge's works and some Watts' works and things like that. So it's a very mixed economy by the 18th century.
Thank you, both. Any other questions? We still have a little bit of time to take a couple of more, either in the chat or feel free to ask. Isabel, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, thanks. I wondered if I could pick up again on the point that Tessa made about the oral. I mean, in a way, the problem is we're all academics. Here we are. We're all sitting about thinking about how do books get put into print and what goes in and what goes out. And we're all mad about all the apparatus of books. I mean, it's part of our lives, our daily lives, writing footnotes, bibliographies, indexes, all these things. And Tessa's point really made me think about, there is, going back to Watts again, who is, I suppose the most, in a way, one of the most important authors in terms of popularity for a very long time. And I was just thinking of work I did some years ago on the Society for Promoting Religious Knowledge Among the Poor, which distributed texts very widely. And a lot of them went to America, and that fits in with what Tess is very interested in, the crossover. And John Rippon the Baptist, who wrote a history of the society at the end of the, it came out actually about 1802, if I remember rightly. But he includes in that masses of letters that the society had from all the people who distributed their books. So they're secondhand reports, because they're saying, you know, I distributed this book to my parishioners or my people from my meeting house, and these are the things they said. And of Watts, there's some fascinating stuff from America about slaves singing Watts's hymns. And when I read that, I thought, gosh, this is extraordinary. And I don't know how much, I mean, you know, I just don't know how much work has been done on slave culture. I mean, there must have been this would have been I can't remember now the letter that he cites. It would be probably from about 1760, something like that. But I mean, this idea that from this text of Watts, this is providing some kind of relief from the appalling circumstances of their lives. And when I first read that, I was just absolutely sort of gobsmacked. And I thought, this really puts our whole activity as academics and editors and interpreters into a completely different context.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. I agree, absolutely. It does. And it's quite hard to know. I'm trying to remember the name of the person, who maybe someone else here can enlighten me, but there is somebody who has done work on the oral cultures and English, as in not English language, but from England, songs and poems that became part of the culture of slave communities in America and also the Caribbean in the 18th century, which is quite important work, but very difficult to recover. And I'm thinking also in terms of Watts's influence. Phyllis Wheatley, of course, is often kind of presented in those terms at the time and is now, but we don't know how much Watts she knew before she learned to read, and you know how much Watts came with her, as opposed to being something she was given in this when she was taught to read and became a literary figure in her own right.
Neil?
It was only just to agree with Isabel, and indeed one could make the point more largely that there's dealing with the sorts of texts that we are dealing with, there is a real sense in which we're just missing the point all the time. They're not there for us to discuss or to wonder about or to edit. They were there to change lives, and we're not going to let them do that. So I agree with Isabel.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Perhaps if there was one last one, it would be very nice. Has anybody?
I think Alison has her hand raised, Anne.
Oh, actually, sorry, I couldn't say that. Alison, can you actually speak, or do you want to write it down in the chat? Oh, here she is. Hello, Alison.
Thank you both very much. I enjoyed that so much. And I just wanted to second the importance of what Isabel said. I've been working with some Society of the Propagation of the Gospel correspondents in the early 18th century. And there's some extraordinary comments from French Huguenots who become chaplains or missionary pastors in the early, so this is the first 2 decades of the 18th century, dealing with both Native American groups and with enslaved people, and thinking about how to share texts and minister to both white plantation owners and enslaved people within their kind of, nascent parishes. But what's fascinating is also that sometimes what would be considered dissenting communities are actually the establishment in the North American colonies. So some really, really interesting material. I mean, I'm not in a position to speak or give a bunch of examples, but I think that there is some really interesting work being done in that space. It's complicated because of the language issues and the various material transmission processes and how we can recapture that. But I just wanted to say, A, how grateful I was to Isabel for flagging that, and B, to emphasize that I think it's a really critical aspect of our thinking about this in a transatlantic space. And yeah, I'm hoping that more will happen and more will emerge going forward. So thanks both.
Thank you very much, Alison, for that. Right, it's 18:23. If we have no other question, I suggest perhaps we should end here. And thank you so much to both of you for not only accepting our invitation, but also preparing it together. So we really did have and did feel that there was a lot of things in common. And thank you for all the works you've put in, and hope to see you all very, very soon.
Well, thank you very much. And we do indeed hope to see you in person before too long.
Before too long, if that can be possible. We would have loved to have you here in X, as you know, but unfortunately...
Not as much as we would have loved to be there.
It was the right decision in the end, because we didn't know what was going to happen. But it certainly would have been very nice, and we hope to do it again before too long.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for being here and for all those wonderful questions, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
Thank you.